I've got to be honest here, I wasn't really planning on reviewing Onward. I saw it opening weekend, but then as I wrote my initial review, the vibe which I got from the words I wrote down just felt off. I didn't feel like my opinion was being expressed with my own specific style or voice. The sentences ran empty and were inaccurate about my real feelings. So I was already having trouble figuring out just how to talk about Pixar's latest movie, but then, theaters across the entire country shut down not even 2 weeks into its theatrical run. By absolutely no fault of its own, Onward quickly became the worst performing Pixar film in history, settling at a paltry $103 million worldwide at the time of re-recording this video. With this unprecedented turn of events, I was, of course, worried about what the future would hold for movies, but I also lost all motivation to discuss Onward. I figured that nobody would get to see it for months after publishing my review, which then led me to believe that the word of mouth wouldn't really do any good. Disney then made the decision to make it available for VOD on March 20th, with Disney Plus streaming beginning on April 3rd. So, I decided to give my review of Onward another shot. But since my thoughts were so muddled around that first time I saw this, I wanted to watch it again just to make sure. Everything I'll be talking about today is based on that second viewing and how it confirmed those mixed feelings I was having in the theater. Let us examine why Pixar's Onward frustrated me. My use of the word frustrating was intentional. After all, I don't hate this movie. I find it hard to even say that I dislike it. But when I think of my experience with Onward, all that comes to mind is how much better it could have been. Allow me to address this within the context of other Pixar movies from the past decade that weakened their reputation. Cars 2 was an absolute embarrassment, and inarguably the worst movie that they've made so far. But that movie doesn't really make me angry necessarily, it's bad in sort of an admirable way. Brave is also kind of frustrating, but more so because of how I think it wasted a lot of its potential. Monsters University was a movie I rewatched pretty recently, and even though it has a lot of good qualities and a surprisingly strong ending, it is just very disposable. I didn't think that Monsters Inc. needed a prequel before this came out, and I felt the same after I saw it. The Good Dinosaur features incredibly gorgeous environments, but is so bleak and devoid of entertainment value that it offers very little to its audience. Because of that, I've only watched it once, and have never felt the urge to watch it again. And now we arrive at Onward, a movie that, in terms of how the industry measures success, has actually been liked by a fair amount of people. The public reception of Pixar's first original production since Coco has seemingly been positive. Yet if that's the case, why do I put it in the same category as the aforementioned movies? Well, you see, those films are less regarded than most other Pixar classics because even though they may not be that bad, they could otherwise leave one feeling empty, depressed, or even upset. I lump in Onward with them because it wants its audience to believe that it was good simply because it ends off with a meaningful ending. I recognize that I might be oversimplifying things here, but although the movie does reach for those sweet feels, within the context of the rest of the movie, the ending fails to really bring things together for me. From my experience at least, it leaves me feeling as empty as the rest of those movies, even though I would be quicker to watch Onward than most of those. There are a few specific reasons why, but before I get into more of that, please be aware that a spoiler warning is now in effect. Just a couple of days after watching Onward for a second time, I found myself alone at home doing some housework. But then all of a sudden, I felt an urge to do a marathon of Pixar's entire filmography, beginning with the one that started it all, the original Toy Story. I was immediately sucked into this movie, just as I had been during each watch throughout my life. But something struck me about it this time around. The first 15 minutes or so are a masterclass in introducing you to a story's unique world, set of rules, and how the characters have to deal with living life by those rules. And I absolutely love how all of this is established by the creative ways we see the characters interact with each other. Andy's toys are basically like a bustling corporate workplace where everyone has to be in sync with each other. This becomes even more apparent when they all gather together for a staff meeting led by Woody to discuss current and upcoming issues happening in Andy's room. Things escalate when it's revealed that Andy's birthday party has suddenly been moved to that very day. So as we all know, what takes place from here is that the Green Army men move in for a reconnaissance mission, the toys listen and react to the news, and once Buzz Lightyear is introduced to the gang, a power struggle ensues between Woody and Buzz. Of course, I could talk about all the other really cool things Pixar did with their Toys Are Alive concept, but I want to stay focused on these first scenes for a reason. When it comes to world building, first impressions are very, very important. After all, how many times have you seen some kind of fantasy, sci-fi, or even a Disney movie start with the words,
"Long ago, once upon a time"?
These are classic phrases for a reason, but literally every time this happens, you know that you're about to get a bunch of exposition dumped on you. As much as I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy, even the Fellowship of the Ring is guilty of it. To put the audience at ease and comfortably introduce them into the world you've created, you have to be a bit creative yourself. And another great example of this is the original Star Wars movie. Sure, it might feature the iconic and storybook-like title card you see here, but then... this musical score literally comes crashing down on you, knocking you off your feet, and demanding your attention. The minimal information you do get from the opening crawl that follows is enough to provide context for what you're about to see, and then you're hooked as soon as you see those two ships battling in the skies above Tatooine. But to return back to my discussion of Pixar, for the most part, they do a pretty good job at giving you a strong, worthwhile opening. Toy Story is especially successful with this because it shows that the toys may do and say things that reflect what humans do in real life, but their everyday behavior and attributes are what you would expect of sentient toys. Of course a group of toys united by the same goal would have staff meetings, for they could discuss issues that affect them as toys. Of course they would have Green Army men be the ones who would gather intelligence for them. And of course, they would all gather around a kid's walkie-talkie and try to figure out who their next toy companions would be. In fact, watching that scene reminded me of how Nintendo fans react when watching a Smash Bros. Character reveal. But you all know that Toy Story is a wonderful movie. You all know that it established a creative and fun world to watch on screen, which was only built upon with its 3 amazing sequels. The reason you clicked on this video was to hear me talk about Onward. So with that in mind, how does Pixar's latest movie open?
Long ago.
Ugh. Okay, so not even a minute in, and Onward has already gotten a strike. But given that it riffs on the kind of high fantasy you might expect from a game of D&D or a traditional fairy tale, it makes sense why the movie would start this way. People are used to seeing fantasy films start like this, and coupling that with a montage of mythical creatures doing magical things makes that more enjoyable. Our expectations are thrown off as soon as we see this once magic-dependent civilization innovate and discover the power of modern technology, which causes everyone to forget magic and fall into a state of complacency. That in and of itself is a fascinating idea, and if we're talking about what might happen if a fairy tale universe found themselves in a timeline similar to our own, getting to that point would naturally make sense. Here's where problems start to settle in though. The first of these is something I'll discuss a bit later, but the other and arguably more problematic issue is what the filmmakers ultimately did with the universe they created. Almost every location in this movie feels like it was ripped straight out of our reality and changed ever so slightly with the most minute details. I can appreciate the occasional commitment to subtle background details like the fact that the Manicore's map to the Phoenix Gem looks like the map of Middle-earth, but other than that, what location in this movie really stands out? Everywhere that the characters go in this movie just feels like somewhere people would go in normal everyday life. To name off a few examples, there's your typical high school, a family restaurant reminiscent of Peter Piper Pizza, a pawn shop, and a gas station. Inherently, I don't have any problem with the characters going to places like this, especially with the context that the movie lays out for us, and the fact that other Pixar films feature similar locations. However, it makes this particular film unable to stick in my memory, since none of these areas feel like they naturally belonged. These places just come across as human edifices occupied by mythical creatures. Well, aside from the houses that have mushroom tops for roofs anyway. In other Pixar films that feature characters living in a human-like environment, those involved with the art direction found ways to make their behavior unique to the worlds they belong to. You could think about Mike Wazowski applying odorant, a doctor's visit in Cars being equivalent to a car being worked on by a mechanic, or the all-digital world of the Axiom. My point is that Pixar is really, really good at matching their concepts with logical world building, but none of that applies here, which made the film a lot less interesting for me to watch overall. Even then, once the story actually gets to its third act when the Lightfoot brothers are in considerably more fascinating locations, not only is it a little too late for the movie to regain my interest, these scenes feel much more like imitations of Indiana Jones than something fresh and exciting. So with all of this working against the film, it was tough for me to see a reason why the characters needed to be fantasy creatures, which leads me to my next point. Usually, there's a justifiable reason why a storyteller at Pixar matches a story with a unique concept. And it goes beyond simply having characters in a setting that can be easily marketed to families. Like any good animation, Pixar's movies tend to take subject matter that wouldn't be as palatable in live action, and then discovers a way to balance a story and a message. Like a cynical businessman once said, they find a way to make all the little cogs mesh together. Overcoming devastating loss, the wealthy taking advantage of the poor, overcoming puberty, and mental illness, Pixar has tackled a lot of tough subjects such as these, and manages to do a pretty good job at providing valuable insights with each new movie. Onward is no different. The whole idea of the movie stems from director Dan Scanlon's childhood. He has gone on record saying that he and his brother lost their father at pretty much the exact same ages as Ian and Barley did, with an audio recording of his father, later inspiring him to write this deeply personal story. I can only imagine that writing the screenplay and making it into a feature was very cathartic for him, and with that, I don't want to diminish any personal connection someone might have to this movie if their life story is similar. But the thing is that the urban fantasy setting feels disappointing in its execution and doesn't really match up with the underlying themes of the story. While medieval Scotland made sense for a traditional Disney fairy tale in Brave, Remy's employment at Cousteau's made sense for Ratatouille, and Miguel going to the land of the dead made sense for Coco, what does the setting of Onward really do for the story? In my estimation, the only reason why Onward takes place in the chosen setting is so that Disney could have an easier time selling this really weird concept of two brothers traveling with a walking pair of pants to the public. Take out the aspect of magic being forgotten from the world, and it does very little to affect the actual plot. It's an element that felt tacked on, and Pixar could have easily told this story if it featured human characters and never incorporated any magic. Now, I'm not saying that the premise does nothing for the story. In terms of what goes on between Ian and Barley, their scenes involving magic do make a difference. Usually it's incorporated for the purpose of character building moments, such as Ian gaining trust in himself as he creates the invisible bridge, which is probably my favorite scene in the movie if I'm being quite honest. Other examples include their tunnel ride on the Cheeto raft together, and then escaping certain death in the catacomb. The rock dragon creature is also a very neat catalyst for the climax, featuring an eye-catching design that boasts of Pixar's raw creativity. But other than these examples, the urban fantasy setting is shockingly boring, at least to me. I already mentioned how the locations did very little for me, but the characters themselves and how they change in the end just didn't really register. The Manticore going from being a stressed out restaurant manager back to her warrior roots was kind of forced. The Centaur's stepfather cop dude ditching a patrol vehicle for his legs didn't do anything for me, not even comedically. And the payoff for Ian and Barley's mom using a workout video at home also felt really weird and cringeworthy to me. And with that, we have another good opportunity to transition to the next point. Due to how Onward was executed, I think Pixar would have been better off if they went with either one of two approaches. One, making a dramatic and emotionally investing adventure like the DreamWorks classic How to Train Your Dragon, or two, leaning much more into the comedy and just having a little bit of adventure like Monsters, Inc. But instead, they tried to make something that has adventure and comedy in equal measure, which could have worked, yet very little of either felt satisfying to me. I won't focus on the adventure aspect just yet, since I pretty well covered that already with my prior points, and I still have some other things to say which relate to that. But honestly, this movie couldn't really have been less funny. Plenty of Pixar films have taken advantage of the fact that they're animated to heighten their sense of humor, in which they do things such as incorporating a ton of unique environmental and character traits to poke fun at them, clever wordplay, well-timed slapstick, and exaggerated character animations such as those you might find in the Brad Bird Pixar movies.
Good evening, everyone.
Onward tries to do these things on occasion, and a couple of moments admittedly did make me laugh, like this throwaway moment.
I'm giving you to the count of 3.
Most of the time, though, the cutaway gags and attempts at situational humor never felt witty or timed well enough to truly be funny to me. They were obvious cues for laughter, and usually humor needs to be much more spontaneous and snappy to work on me. All of the potentially meme-worthy moments were basically ruined by the trailers, too. Also, as Adam from Your Movie Sucks pointed out, the writers even recycled some jokes and comedic situations from previous Pixar movies. The pawn shop interaction felt like a rehash of the scene with the witch in Brave, but that's more incidental due to the lighting and color choices. A more blatant example consists of this moment.
You got a problem, Shades.
And then this scene reminded me of a certain moment from Finding Nemo.
I'm dead. dead, I'm dead, I died, I'm dead.
But okay, so the humor doesn't really work that well for me. At least the film is paced decently enough, for the plot always has a destination for the characters to go, or a task to complete once things get going. And even though the environments and situations are usually rather bland, I never felt that the movie was slow enough to be truly boring. A couple of the set pieces are even pretty fun, such as the freeway chase you're watching right now. But again, my key issue with the plot goes back to how the core premise felt like it was wasted. The pacing could have been exciting or interesting instead of passable if the writers found a way to tell their story without retrofitting it into a predictable family movie formula. Beats in the story occur where you'd expect them to, very forced drama between the characters takes away from a genuine emotional impact, and all of the fluff thrown in to expand the plot beyond the Lightfoot brothers' central quest took away from what was most interesting about the story to me, which was the unique premise that didn't really come across as your average kids film. You see, a reason why I've come to adore Studio Ghibli's films is that they were never afraid to tackle very serious subjects in their stories. They still managed to evoke plenty of whimsy, fantasy, and escapism, but never at the expense of the message they wanted to share. The truly gifted artists at Pixar have done this many times with their movies as well, but a key difference between the output of these studios is that Pixar almost always uses a gimmick to make their material more easily digestible, and more importantly, easier for Disney to sell. I know that's a cynical way of looking at things, but please bear with me here. Onward just made this pattern more apparent to me, for the narrative of two brothers chasing after their last chance to spend time with their dad was poorly integrated with the rest of the story. I wouldn't complain about this nearly as much if the fantasy setting was actually used well, but it isn't, so I just felt underwhelmed by its implementation, since it was done only to market the story more easily to families. Aside from that though, there are a few things I could nitpick, but it's their job to do that. The one thing I will harp on is the fact that Disney keeps pretending like they care about the LGBT community.
It's not easy being a new parent. My girlfriend's daughter got me pulling my hair out, okay?
On its own, this comment is perfectly fine and I have no problem with it whatsoever. I'm genuinely happy for my friends in that community who are getting at least some kind of recognition in Hollywood movies. That being said, I just hate Disney's scummy practice of using this fake representation as bait for social media brownie points, hyping up something as a huge landmark achievement for their movie, only to be a throwaway moment that can easily be censored out for certain audiences. It's old, it's tired, and Disney should actually consider doing genuine representation for once. Kind of like when Russell, an Asian kid, was allowed to be this adorable lead character in Up without needing to pay unnecessary attention to it. But enough about that. Let's talk about the final and definitely most crucial reason for why Onward frustrates me. The relationship between these brothers frustrates me so much that this movie never works as well as I wanted it to. But before I explain why, I want to address that my life experience couldn't be any more distant from the baggage Ian and Barley deal with. I've been fortunate to have both of my parents for my entire life, and I am also happy that the dynamics between me and my two siblings were much different as well. They had already gone through the process of growing up, getting married, and moving out by the time I was in junior high. So nothing I'm gonna say about Ian and Barley is meant to reflect any opinions I have about brotherhood. I am just examining how their relationship works in the context of the movie I watched and wrestled with. With that being said, I know I have already been going on for a while, but I need to mention some positives to balance out the negatives. First off, I like the base level characterization of Ian. Even though he feels like a copy of Tom Holland's Peter Parker in animated elf form, this character's own teenage quirks feel genuine and unique to his own experience. It's established rather effectively in the first act that he's socially awkward, tries to keep to himself, and struggles with self-confidence, but that's all made up by the fact that he wants to overcome all these things. He has a desire to make himself more like the model citizen as dad became in adulthood, and it's a clear motive behind many of the forward-thinking decisions he makes throughout the story. Another trait of his that actually made a difference with the story is that he's somewhat selfish. You might not think that at first, but that's because the writers depicted that with subtlety. Notice that when Barley first tells Ian about the visitation spell, Ian says,
I'm gonna meet Dad?
He doesn't mention anything about the two of them, just himself. And this is consistent with his choice of words and behavior for much of the film, given that he's dismissive and embarrassed by his nerdy older brother. That all comes to a head later when Barley says,
You know, I want to see him too.
Frankly, I thought this aspect of their relationship was handled beautifully. I also like that the film shows that conflict between siblings is far deeper than any sort of soap opera might lead you to believe, because even though issues may be there, nobody would want to just bring them up in everyday conversation, since that could spark unnecessary conflicts or even drive the other person away. Ian and Barley may not say much to each other in terms of outward expressions of love, but it's easy to tell that there's enough compassion between the two of them to not intentionally hurt the other person. This makes the infamous screw-up scene at least work from a conceptual point of view, because yeah, why would Ian want to tell Barley that he's a screw-up to his face? What kind of douchebag would just say that to their sibling, let alone their older one? Yet, I think this is the absolute worst scene in the movie, because that reveal almost breaks the entire film for me. My problem with this conflict isn't that we learn that Barley's considered to be a screw-up by his peers, it's the fact that we never learn why. This could have been a golden opportunity to provide backstory for Barley and context for why he acts the way he does. I don't necessarily need an explanation for his love of role-playing games, since the movie pretty well implies that he enjoys how it portrays the history of their universe. But because of the fact that all we learn about him is that he's a ridiculously obsessive D&D nerd and feels guilty for not saying goodbye to his dad, well, I don't feel that's enough to get the whole picture for him. Because of this, when we learn that everyone thinks Barley is a screw-up, all that comes to mind is why? Did he ever have any motivations in life? What was he like in school? Did he lose a job due to negligence or stupidity? Does he care about anything other than his games and Guinevere? At least a couple of these things would have been beneficial for giving us more insight into who he is. But ultimately, Barley just boils down to being a stereotypical neckbeard. It really sucks because I wanted to have more reasons to be invested in him, considering that Chris Pratt's vocal performance was rather bland. I know what you're thinking, and to that I say, no. I don't think Jack Black would have been a good replacement. Hearing his voice come out of this character would have been weird to me. Not only is it an insult to many hardworking and successful people that play D&D that Barley is broadly portrayed this way, it's even worse that he himself has very little development as a character. Everything he does is either in service of moving the plot forward, or because of what someone else does. Even his choice to sacrifice Guinevere for a greater cause isn't given enough emotional weight beyond just a funny moment with the not Led Zeppelin background music. Most everything else he does is in service of Ian's arc, effectively reducing him to a talking plot device in situations where Ian needs to learn magic or provide exposition to the audience. And as much as one could argue that his character development involves him compassionately being there for Ian, that's an innate attribute he always actively flexed during the story. I never questioned that Barley selflessly loved his brother, for it was always apparent that he did. There's just so much more they could have done to make this relationship worthwhile. If they balanced things out with characterization for these two, I probably would have had a higher opinion of this movie overall. Instead, I'm left disappointed that the only audience character we get is Ian, who does experience good growth as a character, but at the expense of any real depth for Barley. Just imagine how interesting it would have been if they included a conflict where Barley was jealous of Ian's natural ability to conjure magic. Just like the fascinating and compelling dynamic between Billy Batson and his roommate/accomplice Freddy and Shazam, a conflict of jealousy would have made things more dramatic, but certainly more interesting and realistic. Giving Barley more flaws to overcome and learn from would have been a more natural way of developing the story, instead of forcing clumsily written and cliched moments like this scene that are eventually compensated by a predictably rushed reconciliation and overbearing musical score typical of animated movies like this. It's just unfortunate that his character ended up being the way he was, because not only is Chris Pratt's vocal performance kind of annoying, but the characterization is thinly drawn, and he's mostly there just to serve as a means for Ian to change. For a movie that hinges so much on the central sibling relationship, the fact that there's little balance or chemistry between them just ruined any chance for Onward to really work for me. Despite all that I've said, I don't hate this movie at all. I find it to be pretty watchable actually. Sure, there may be plenty of failed attempts at humor and the story leaves much to be desired, but its tone and pacing work well enough. There's enough going on with the good things I've already mentioned, as well as the gorgeous animation, to say that the experience of watching Onward was worth something. And also, if you happen to like or even love this movie, all the power to you! I know my take could be considered a hot one because of how much I've dogged on things that have actually worked for many other people. There have certainly been many people who relate to this movie on a deeply personal level, and this review was never meant to change that. If either you just enjoyed yourself or had a profound emotional connection to the story, treasure those experiences, and don't let my criticisms dissuade you from how you truly feel. But at the same time, I can't pretend that I share the goodwill others have felt, because I don't. For me, Onward is the most frustrating Pixar movie I have ever seen. Not the worst, not the most cringeworthy, neither even the most disappointing, just frustrating. I look at this movie and think of all the other possibilities of what could have been done to make this story incredible. I just wish to express that I have loved Pixar for literally my entire life, and I still do to this day, but because of this, I don't want to see them fail. The last thing I would want to see the studio become is just another DreamWorks, Blue Sky, or heaven forbid Illumination, a corporate-minded, creatively bankrupt company whose best works are behind them. They are far from that point, of course, but given how Onward turned out, I would hope that they keep putting as much effort into pushing the boundaries of storytelling as they do with animation technology. Their upcoming original production, Soul, has a lot of potential, but even so, there's always room to be skeptical. Here's to hoping that this is the last time I feel this frustrated about a Pixar movie.